Hi, my name is Katelyn Kawamura from Ball Hill, Washington. In my research, I learned about the Growth Management Act and its limits on urbanization of rural regions. What plans does the Housing Committee have to ensure surrounding infrastructure and facilities are able to compensate for increased population growth in urban areas?
Well, that is really a great question because the Growth Management Act was actually done probably a little over 30 years ago now to kind of respond to the growth there that we had in the Puget Sound area, and it really didn't consider the rural areas very well. And I've been in government, and I was in local government as a county commissioner for 16 years trying to work to make adjustments to that Growth Management Act as it related to the rural areas, because there is a lot of pressure on those areas because people do want to stay in the rural areas, but there aren't the considerations for a natural outgrowth within those areas. So we've set aside certain what we call landlords. Those are local areas of more intense rural development, but they're restricting right now within the growth management the build out of urban services, that being sewer and water. So I think it's important for us to consider that because that is a very important element to growth. We have to make the accommodations to those areas that have the natural pressures. People are desiring to go into the rural areas. And the Growth Management Act had 13 goals originally set aside to make sure that planning was done in an orderly fashion. And what we aren't really considering is the fact that there's a changing dynamic in our society. And what I mean by that is that people will often look at rural areas and think that you need to have, big open spaces, and that is typically what you're going to find. But those big open spaces used to be farmland, and we're finding that, farming has not been as profitable, and so people are tending to get out of the business. And so we need to incorporate some good planning mechanisms to allow for build out in the rural areas. One of the things that we did in my county is we allowed for cluster developments, which minimized the impact on the land. It created the open space that still had that rural feel, but allowed for a little higher intensity development for the housing. So I'm hopeful that we can continue to make some strides. Unfortunately, what we've seen through the legislature is a real resistance to changing the Growth Management Act for fear that we're going to have this proliferation of building in the rural areas. But we need to have a natural, orderly growth in all areas of our state. And I think we need to, accommodate those natural pressures that are there and that are continuing to come because people do enjoy, rural living. They want to have that rural feel. And we should be able to accommodate those desires.
Thank you for that question, Katelyn. And I love that you're reading about the Growth Management Act because it's a law in Washington state that has a very direct role in what types of housing and how much housing we can actually create. The question about how do we have enough infrastructure and guarantee that we have enough infrastructure to accommodate population growth actually comes up quite a bit. First, I would say that the Growth Management Act stipulates that we need to concentrate the new growth of our population primarily in cities. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that we're building housing as efficiently as possible. Cities typically have the infrastructure that's already there, the amenities, the restaurants, the schools, not to mention stormwater systems, the roads. Because they're already there, it makes more sense to have people, as our population grows, accommodate housing in those areas. Because if you were to allow for all of that population growth to occur in our more rural areas, you're going to deplete the ability of farmland, forests, ecosystems, and it's also exponentially more expensive to provide new infrastructure further out. For every mile of road, the stormwater pipes that you have to run, the drinking water pipes that you have to run, the electrical lines that you have to run, it just makes more sense to have them all in those concentrated areas where we already have those infrastructure systems. That being said, over time, there are more demands on infrastructure if you add more people. Cities have a tool, it's a requirement, they have capital facilities planning. So as they look at their population growth targets over the next 20 years, they know they have estimates of how much they're going to grow. not only do they have to look at how much housing and what types of housing units or what types of housing, like single family, accessory dwelling units, duplexes, those varieties that will accommodate the income bands within the population growth, they also have to look at what does that mean for their infrastructure. So that's things like stormwater, wastewater, utilities, making sure they'll have enough garbage service, employees to do that service. So they have to plan in 6-year increments. It's called your capital facilities plan. And that's a part of their standard business. They have to do it according to law. It's a standard part of their comprehensive plan process. I would also say that when we think about infrastructure, one of the things that people say or think about or fear is that, if we have all this new density by changing these zoning laws, we're going to have all of a sudden a ton of new housing. It's just going to, overnight, we're going to have the highest capacity of these housing types that's now allowable. And that's not actually how we see housing development occur in cities. Generally, you see with things like middle housing, duplexes, or ADUs, you're going to see a slow accumulation over time. And hopefully with those two types, especially, you're going to see infill. So that's in areas that are already developed and already have the stormwater systems. We also know that home sizes, family sizes are getting smaller over time. For instance, I have a single family home. It was built in 1953. And at that time, the average family was about 5 people. But now I've lived in that house for a number of years on my own with that stormwater system and all the infrastructure. Now I have 2 people living there, still a smaller size than in 1953 with that average home size. So you can actually see more home types and more homes come up, but because smaller family sizes, it's not going to be as high of a demand on infrastructure. So that's how we ensure that we have adequate infrastructure for those population growth. The other thing I would add is that we always become more efficient with our technology. So as time goes by, hopefully that will happen as well. So we won't need as much infrastructure. However, we always want to make sure that we have like stormwater, for example. We also have challenges with current population with some of those facilities. There are places where they need to be upgrading those and figuring out how they're financially going to do that. And that will always be a challenge.